Hello, everyone. So today I'm bringing you to the Gov Victory Road document that John Uysal created. Um, I wanted to take you through a couple things. He has an area where you can print out some other things, and I've been working on some Quizlets and concurrence with what he has here and some notes that I have. So today, if you want to tune in, I just wanted to make a video that kind of goes over all of Unit 1. So that way you don't have to do any extra studying and you can make sense of this. So what the place that I wanted to start and I thought that made the most sense would be to start with the philosophers because that's where all of the ideas originated. So Locke was that guy that basically Jefferson stole from, and he had the idea of a social contract with inalienable rights. So basically, people would give up other rights, like the ability to take each other's property, for the security of more important things, like their life, their liberty, and the property that actually belongs to them. But he believed that this social contract could be given up if the government didn't follow the guidelines of the people's natural rights. So people could abolish that abusive government and reform it and make a new one. Hobbes, on the other hand, thought people were self-interested, and he didn't believe that it would be a good idea to allow this sacred social contract to ever be broken. So he believed in monarchy, and he believed that this monarch was entitled. So the people and the huddled masses should not have a place in any kind of say in government. On the other hand, if you look at the Declaration of Independence, that's heavily influenced by Rousseau. Rousseau was a guy who believed in the idea of popular sovereignty, which is the idea of rule by the people. So if you think about direct democracy back in Athens, because we like world history, direct democracy was where people just kind of showed up at the town hall meetings. They said what they wanted to. They said their piece. They were happy. It's good. And that's how laws got passed, was by the people. Now, the framers kind of recognized this wouldn't be logical in such a huge republic, but we'll get to that in the Federalist Papers. Montesquieu, on the other hand, he looked at England's separation of powers with their different branches and their system and thought, well, we should apply this to other governments. And so the framers took that idea and they created a system that divides powers out among a judicial, executive, and legislative branch. And by creating these different branches and separating their powers, it also created a limited government. And that's a key term because limited government would prevent people from basically being abused by the government because there would be checks and balances in place so that the other branches could make sure that people's rights are upheld. And so that's kind of a rundown on the four philosophers that majorly influenced what we like to call the D of I. So the Declaration of Independence was more of a letter to Great Britain saying, all right, screw you. But it also has some really important key terms and ideological concepts that are supposed to be embedded in our government today, but we're just going to go with the idea that it's totally in our government today. In that note, the Declaration of Independence upheld the idea of natural rights in the form of Jefferson stealing and plagiarizing, but you know. And there's also popular sovereignty and the idea of a social contract that could be broken, and ding ding ding, that should remind you of Locke, who once again Jefferson stole from. Anyway, it's not that I hate Jefferson. He's cool. I read a book on him. He's cool. I guess. But he stole from Locke. Anyway, I'm over it. Basically, following the Declaration of Independence, I think it'd be important to talk about the different types of democracy since I addressed direct democracy. So, democracy, just in general, is a government system that's derived from the will of the people, and that could be directly from the people itself voting or through elected officials doing their bidding. Now, there's three main types of democracy then. There's participatory democracy, that's in a democracy in which citizens can participate directly in their government. And we even have this in certain situations today through referendums and initiative procedures. And you can take a look on that on your own time. It's very interesting how people can weigh in on things on their own, even things that have already been made a law. And also, we have pluralist democracy, which is a bunch of interest groups vying for power. And in Federalist 10, Madison kind of talks about this idea about how power in a large republic can be kept in check by this idea of pluralist democracy, because no single faction is going to be able to get too strong. Leanist democracy, on the other hand, is something that Hamilton liked, because obviously he was an aristocrat, so obviously he'd like it. But it was just kind of a small number of people ruling that supposedly knew what was best for the people. And in a way, we kind of have that. Like, the Electoral College was for that purpose, so that the minority people wouldn't be outvoiced by the people who had a majority. That's why you can have elections where people win the popular vote, but another candidate actually ends up winning because they win the electoral vote. And so goes the huge argument about reforming the system. But once again, that's another story. So, as you know, we've touched on these key topics right here that I decided to skip for the purpose of coming back to them to see if you'd remember what they mean. So we talked about limited government a little bit. You know what natural rights are. You know what the social contracts are in terms of Locke and Hobbes. And you know what popular sovereignty is. But we didn't really talk about this key idea of republicanism. And that's basically, if you want to think about it in terms of another term, just think of representative democracy. You vote for a bunch of officials, and they represent you. They're supposed to do your bidding. Republicanism. And yeah, so that's an introduction to the formulation of our government, and at least the ideals that we wanted to employ. Now, it didn't go so well. We had a Confederation Congress where, well, we made a really, really sucky form of government, for lack of a better word. It was called the Articles of Confederation, and it couldn't enforce anything. It pretty much couldn't do anything, and the states were pretty much just sovereign. They were in this quote-unquote League of Friendship. But it was all born out of fear of tyranny and loss of democratic ideas over time. So, in one way, they were trying to do what was best. But it didn't turn out so good because they made this requirement that to pass new laws, 9 out of the 13 states had to somehow agree, and they all were very self-interested states, of course, so that was difficult. And if you even wanted to amend the broken system, you had to get all of them to agree. So we're going to look at one instance here called Shay's Rebellion, but before we do that, I want you to just take a look here at all of the weaknesses of the Articles of Confederation and think about how an uprising of farmers could actually be quite serious. So first of all, they couldn't tax anybody, so they didn't have any money to actually do anything. So they couldn't have any federal programs. They just kind of sat there for the cloud, I guess. And they couldn't regulate any trade. So no trade between the states, because that hadn't been established yet by the precedent of McCulloch v. Maryland. Once again, story for another time. We'll get to that. And so they also couldn't have a militia. They had to request basically the armies of other states to bail them out. Now, I want you to think about how that might have an impact on Shay's rebellion before we get to that. They also didn't have separation of powers, but it wasn't really that great anyway, because what they did have wasn't even powerful at all and had no powers. And like I was mentioning, each state had one vote, so I mean, you could imagine the large states being frustrated by the fact that the smaller state would be equal to them. And so, in general, all of these consequences played themselves out in what we know as Shay's Rebellion. So basically, it was a bunch of angry farmers running around the Massachusetts countryside, all angry because they were Revolutionary War veterans, and so they couldn't pay their debt, and they had worked for the freedom of the country, and they weren't being treated right. So I mean, their homes are being foreclosed on. They couldn't afford anything, so they led a rebellion. And usually rebellions like this could be put down easily by a government. But the states didn't come to the federal government's rescue, and so these angry farmers just kind of marched around until George Washington showed up with some of his former army and shut the thing down on his own. But this just kind of exposed how screwed up the system was if a bunch of farmers could reduce the system to anarchy. And so, we're going to get into a little bit of why the framers wanted to fix this. What they wanted was a constitution. So they met and had this constitutional convention in which George Washington was the president of the convention. In this convention, they decided that, well, it's about time we come up with something else. So all of these two things here are going to be born out of that convention. But I want to start a little bit earlier with what happened at the Constitutional Convention here. So every state, except for Rhode Island, because Rhode Island was bitter, met to amend the articles because they sucked. So there were three main compromises made because two plans had emerged: the Virginia plan and the New Jersey plan. The Virginia plan was heavily favoring the large states, and the New Jersey plan countered the Virginia plan because, well, the smaller states were kind of angry that the large states had a plan and they wanted to look cool too. So the Virginia plan basically wanted a two-house legislature, bicameral, and that would benefit the larger states because they both would be based on population. Well, the little states didn't like that so much, so their plan said that instead, let's have a unicameral legislature. And let's do the exact same thing as the articles are already doing, one vote per state. So that didn't really change anything, and the framers weren't really feeling that, so they took both plans, they shoved them into one, they said, there you go, compromise, after a lot of deliberation. They ended up deciding on a bicameral Congress in which the Senate, the upper house, would be based on equal representation, the idea that the smaller states wanted. So there'd be 100 senators, and each state would get 2. Now, obviously, at that time, there weren't 50 states, so it would have looked a little different, but the idea was that each state would get 2 senators. And then, to incorporate the Virginia plan a little bit so that the larger states would actually support this, they had the two-house legislature, which is what they wanted, and for the lower house, the House of Representatives, that was based off of state population. So that all made everyone happy, sort of, until we got to other problems. Now, problem number 2, how are we going to elect a president so that the masses don't screw everything up? Now, let's remember something real quick. The framers were all rich dudes, rich white guys, and they were self-interested. So they created this Electoral College to favor the elitist people. And that's why the Electoral College is often called elitist, because it is. Basically, they wanted to protect the ideas of democracy from the huddled masses that couldn't properly think for themselves and were easily pressured into believing things by random media sources, which is kind of true. And they wanted that loud mass of people to not overpower the more sensible minority that was also white and rich. So they decided, let's make an electoral college in which the popular vote will always be squashed by the electoral votes. And that is why people want to reform the system, because there's so many states that swing heavily blue or heavily red that don't get properly represented because all they need is a majority in order to get one set number of delegates. The Electoral College is actually very interesting, though, and I think you should check out the Electoral College video in the document to kind of learn a little bit more about it. You can learn about how basically if a candidate wins a state and it wins the electoral votes, what the people have voted for are not actually the candidate. They voted for electors to vote for that person. So throughout history, there's this whole idea of hoping for a faithless elector, but that's so rare, but you should look into it. It's very interesting. Also, the final compromise that the framers were a little bit afraid of because it's very hypocritical was the 3/5 compromise. And so the southern states were still gung-ho about their slavery system, and everyone likes that. So they decided, in order to get the southern states to actually want this whole constitution thing to work out, they would be nice and say, well, if you have some African Americans living in your state, which you don't consider as people, you can count them as people, but you can count them only as 3/5 of a person. And so that would increase their representation. So because it wasn't 2/5 and 3/5 is a nicer number, they decided to go along with it. And that's always nice. And frankly, because of this 3/5 compromise, you can honestly, sadly say that maybe that's why the Constitution got through. But I want you to also take a look at Article 4 here, because this is how it was decided how the Constitution would be amended. Now, it's important to note that the details for the Constitution actually being created were outlined in Article 7. So Article 7, we'll go back to Article 5, but Article 7 made this key idea that instead of a unanimous consent vote, which the Anti-Federalists were very, very angry about because they believed that all states should agree, they decided that since Rhode Island was not going to pass the Constitution, they said, let's do 9 out of the 13 states agreeing on this. So that worked out. And so they kind of bypassed state legislatures, but it's okay. All in the name of democracy, I guess, or Democratic Republic, as they would want it to be called. But I want to take a look at some of the latter articles that you guys probably know a little bit less about. So Article 5 outlines the ways in which the Constitution may be amended. So by a proposal of 2/3 of both houses of Congress, or by 2/3 of states calling for a convention, an amendment idea can now be considered for ratification. So 3/4 of state legislatures then would need to ratify this amendment, or 3/4 of special state conventions would have to ratify it. And so if this occurs, then you got a new amendment. And then Article 6 is about Revolutionary War debts, how the Constitution is the supreme law of the land, and there will never be religious tests, thank goodness for that. But I didn't say that out loud. That's offensive. Anyways, moving on. The Revolutionary War debts, the reason they wanted to include that was they wanted to establish the United States as a credible nation. And so basically their logic was that if the United States isn't paying back their debts, well, that's not going to look so good. Other countries aren't going to lend them money. And they're going to be broke, and they're not going to do so well, and they're probably going to get conquered, or Great Britain will probably take them back. And in a sense, that kind of happened. Like, look at the War of 1812, which no one talks about. I mean, Great Britain could have just reconquered us, but they kind of didn't want to. They just wanted the cloud of re-winning, something that they should have won. It's a story for another time, because I don't have time to talk about it. Anyway, a couple things that we're going to talk about are 3 main clauses in the Constitution. It's going to be the Supremacy Clause, it's going to be the Commerce Clause, as well as the Elastic Clause, or the Necessary and Proper Clause. So the Supremacy Clause is found in Article 6 of the Constitution, and that says that the Constitution is the supreme law of the land, and no one's above it. So you basically, it's justification that the Judicial Branch will end up using to overpower any contradictory state or federal laws. So I think that's very important in analyzing this. So I'm going to go back and now talk about the different ideologies between the Federalists and Anti-Federalists for kind of getting all this through. So, here it is. So Federalist number 10 was a famous part of the Federalist Papers, a collection of essays by a group of writers under the name Publius. Madison and Hamilton were probably the most notable of these writers. And so in this essay, Federalist number 10, Madison argues for a representative democracy, that whole idea of republicanism that I talked about. So he believed that a large republic would be able to control factions, and an idea of a pluralist democracy because there would be so many people vying for power that no one group, no one person could become too powerful because there were so many interest groups. And he didn't really want participatory democracy at all because he felt like that would always drown out the voice of the minority. And also, that's kind of why we see what happens with the Electoral College, as I previously explained. So another thing that the framers kind of argued for was a little bit of elite democracy to keep a sense of sensibility, I guess, as long as they're elected by the people. He wasn't as gung-ho about this as his counterpart Hamilton was, but it benefited him. So he argued for it. And we see that a little bit in the Senate, actually. It heavily mimics the House of Lords, which is a form of elite democracy, so you can look more into that. Now, on the opposite side of the Federalists is the Anti-Federalists, and the Anti-Federalists were against a strong central government because they believed that it would be way too distant from the people. Like, it's going to sit in Washington, D.C., and then there's going to be people all throughout the country, and their voices aren't going to be heard. And because of that, and the fact that they were concerned that the central government would start eating state powers, they disliked this idea. They were even concerned that a pluralist democracy would be bad because there would be too many views trying to compete for each other, that it would just make a muddled mess in government. And obviously these people then did not like elite democracy, and they wanted something more decentralized, like the Articles. They weren't really that interested in reforming it so much because they were happy with what they had. So I'm going to move on there and just tell you that, surprise, surprise, it worked out. The Constitution has been there for like an eternity. And it has 3 separate branches and describes the idea of federalism. And we love that term because it's very important and it's probably going to be on the AP test. And if I'm wrong, you can come back and comment and tell me I'm wrong. But it seems important. I'm sure you could use it. So we're going to start with the idea of separation of powers, cough, cough, Montesquieu. And then we're going to go to federalism. So let's just first start with the idea of separation of powers. So in Federalist number 51, Madison addresses this idea that, oh no, this central government's going to be so powerful, they're going to steal all my rights, this is the end of the world. None of that. Madison says there's going to be a 3-branch structure. We got this all figured out. The executive's got their powers, legislative's got theirs, and yeah, there's the judicial. So truth is, framers didn't really anticipate how strong all of these could get, but they separated their powers like so. And so I'm just going to give you a brief overview. Legislative, pass laws, declare war. They can impeach people, that's fun. Impeachment proceedings start in the House. Conviction trials go in the Senate. They have to approve cabinet members and appointments to the justice system. They can establish the number of Supreme Court justices, and thank goodness they can tax and coin money because that wasn't going so well back in the Articles. And the executive well, they have veto power, so they can just kind of sit there, pocket veto, all that good stuff. They're also commander-in-chief. They can grant pardons and reprieves to clearly guilty people. They can appoint judges and ambassadors, cabinet members, but they got to get approved by the legislative checks and balances. I'll get to that. And they conduct foreign affairs, negotiate treaties, all that good stuff. And then the judicial branch just kind of sits there. They got judicial review from Marbury versus Madison. And they hear the cases in the federal law. They preside over impeachment trials, all that good stuff. But their job's just to interpret the law, and that's very important because what's intended by the legislative branch could be completely interpreted differently and by the judicial branch and then implemented like so by the executive. So going back to this, what is the checks and balances? And that is a very boring, interesting idea about how the legislative, executive, and judicial branches interact with each other. So they can all check each other's powers so that no one branch gets too high and mighty and feels too good about itself. So, first of all, the legislative branch, if they want to check the executive branch, they could be a jerk and not approve the president's appointments. They could not approve their judicial appointments. They could conduct impeachment proceedings. And then you got the executive there that could just sit there and be like, well, I don't like you either, Congress, and then just veto everything. But luckily for the legislative branch, they have a check on even that check, where if they get a super majority in both houses, they can override the executive, but that doesn't happen often. And so also, the executive and the legislative branch can also have a very interesting dynamic in which they negotiate and influence each other. A lot of times, in order to get legislation through, the executive might be like, I have this policy, can you implement it? The legislature's like, well, we have this policy. And they kind of compromise on stuff, so there's always that. Unless you're going through, divided government, then compromise is always more difficult, but oftentimes more rewarding. So that's another topic that we can talk about another time. But cramming for AP tests, so not a lot of time. But the judicial branch, they can check the other two powers quite easily. So if the legislative branch passes something that's unconstitutional, they can declare that. If the executive branch's actions are unconstitutional, they can also declare that. But the legislative and executive branches both have power over the judicial branch in the sense that the executive branch can appoint judicial officials, the legislative branch can determine the number of people on the bench, and, well, with an amendment, and they have to be able to approve the executive's appointments, so the judicial branch is kind of contingent on who the legislative branch approves. So that's kind of their relationship. I hope that breaks it down a little bit for you. Judicial review is a really essential topic that I believe we'll get into a little bit more as we move into Unit 2. But the next thing that I wanted to touch on before I end this and go on to policy a little bit was federalism. As John so keenly indicates, it's so important that it could be on the test. We're even seeing it right now with devolution going on in our country. A lot of the powers reserved to the federal government, are now actually just the states are taking over. The governors are making actions. And so federalism, the point of it is to identify concurrent and enumerated powers. Well, okay. Let me rephrase that so that it doesn't get too confusing because all powers are enumerated. Federalism identifies the powers that both the state and the federal government share, called concurrent powers. And it also identifies their exclusive powers and enumerates those exclusive powers to both parties. Okay. So, I just got an iPad notification. Moving on. The framers originally intended federalism to mean the powers that the state has, the powers that the federal government has are separate. But they're co-equal and they're respective to both bodies. Over time, however, the federal government started encroaching upon what the states decided as their powers, and what was decided in the Constitution as their powers, by usage of main clauses such as the Commerce Clause, the Supremacy Clause, and the Elastic Clause. But there were some instances, and also in history, of devolution in the form of U.S. v. Lopez. So, as you can see here, these are powers reserved exclusively to the federal government and the state's exclusive powers, but they also share some powers, so this gets to be a little muddy as to who gets what. But what you need to know is that these guys can coin money. That way you don't have, like, Michigan coins and, like, I don't know, the Louisiana, like, dollar or some crap like that. That's important. And so they have their own militias, but these guys can raise armies, and they are responsible for declaring war and not waiting around for the states to give them some help. I mean, if you get drafted, you get drafted. Like, sucks to be you. Unless you wanted to, I don't know. So, but they also share powers. If the state couldn't tax, it couldn't raise money for itself, but the federal government also needs tax, so that's why you get a double whammy on tax day. And yeah, there's just a bunch of different powers that are exclusive to each of them, but are also shared. So if you want to go through that on your own time, I would definitely recommend it. I don't know how important that is. I would just know a couple examples of this. And also, another way that the federal government interacts with the state governments is kind of through a little bit of a scheme. So basically, the federal government can't change state laws per se, but they can influence the state to change them. So they could do this mostly through categorical grants and mandates, but we're going to start with block grants. So after, like, say, a natural disaster or some horrible thing like 9/11, or even now with the coronavirus, like, the federal government might issue some grants to the states, to people, in order to provide relief for a wide variety of programs. And so, but also the federal government might be issuing these grants for self-interested reasons, as we'll see in the mandate. But for categorical grants, the federal government, if a state decides to implement something, they'll receive funding for that very specific purpose, and that money must be used in a very specific way. In addition, we have mandates, and as I was saying, these are kind of corrupt a little bit. So basically, the federal government might offer a bunch of money for funding for certain things that the states like, but the states can't get that money unless they do something the federal government wants. So, like, say, federal government's like, raise your drinking age, right? The classic example, to like 22 or something. And say, like, Pennsylvania, like, doesn't do that. They're like, no, we like 21. 21's good. But then the federal government's like, well, if you raise it, you get cool highway funding money. Pennsylvania might go like, angry citizens, cool highways. Angry citizens, cool highways, cool highways. And they might choose the cool highways over the angry citizens. So the citizens will be angry because they can't have their booze until they're 22, but they get the federal aid. So you see how that works. Hopefully you don't think of it exactly like that on the test, but hopefully that helps. Another thing in the Constitution is the Fishy Commerce Clause of Article 1, that in McCulloch v. Maryland, it was justified that Congress has the power to regulate interstate commerce because they have the ability to establish a federal bank, and that's reserved to them. That's their power. And in order to have that power, it is implied that they have this other power of interstate commerce regulation. So this is me being mean about Kim. And that's a side conversation if you enjoy that. But I think you can probably go over this article on your own. I don't think it's as important to note of this. Let me see what else I should go over. We talked a little bit about enumerated powers. I did mention the elastic clause a little bit. You're going to see that this is going to be stretched in so many instances, and we'll explore that in a little bit. And the 14th Amendment, that, as you can see here, grants citizenship, equal protection, due process, a law. You'll see that applied to give the African Americans citizenship. And also, it's not listed here, but the 10th Amendment, and it's also in this video, the 10th Amendment is very important because any powers that the federal government was not delegated, those are reserved to the states. So that 10th Amendment kind of puts that in words so that the federal government can't be like, well, they could be my power too. None of that. So we talked about a little bit about McCulloch v. Maryland. Basically, Maryland tried taxing a national bank. That didn't go over so well, so John Marshall was a Federalist, and he was all like, Supremacy Clause, Elastic Clause, all up you guys. And that was the moment when we saw a little bit of centralization, and the states weren't so happy because power was being eaten from them. And it was established that natural banks was a totally legitimate applied power, and regulating interstate commerce there was also important. And so, we're now going to look at an example of devolution. So devolution. Now, I want you to look at the dates here, 1995, 1819. So over time, devolution, centralization, it's kind of like a whoop. I can't really draw that with my cursor, but you get the idea. It's like a cosine curve at Mr. Sod. Anyway, focusing on the actual task. What was I doing? U.S. v. Lopez. So the federal government decided that kids shouldn't be taking guns to school. And they used the Commerce Clause to say, we can regulate interstate commerce. Therefore, we ban the guns. So that didn't work out so well because the Judicial Branch was like, that's not really interstate commerce. And they decided to rule in favor of the states, and it was fine. Kids can bring guns to school. Hence, further issues, but fun stuff. So the last thing that we're going to talk about today is the policy-making process. Now, I want you to think of policy in terms of everything. Bills, all that jazz, that's policy. So every time we sit here and we're like, I hate that. I hate them making them political agendas and what crap. Well, if they don't make that political agenda, then ain't nothing getting done. So stop being hypocritical, okay? So first of all, if you got a politician or even any average old Joe, he's sitting there, he's like, this is an issue. He sets his agenda to fix it. And then he's like, I have an idea. And he goes formulating that policy. That was a horrible highlight. And then he goes to people on the street and he's like, do you want to support my policy? And they're like, we ain't got no money. Stupid politician. But eventually, he gets everyone to agree with the solution. It's implemented, and then he sits there and he assesses it. He was like, is it good? Did it suck? It sucked. And if it sucked, then he's like, shoot, I better check with some other people to see how bad it sucks. And then he fixes it and he makes a new policy. And that's why politicians look corrupt, because they constantly suck and screw up the policy. Actually, that's really harsh, and I don't mean any of that, but hopefully that helps you remember the policy-making process. Now, I believe that covers just about everything on here in terms of what you're going to need to know for Unit 1. Don't believe there's anything else. I'm just going to go through this quick. Nope, I think you guys will be good. So, I have a Quizlet for after this if you want to check it out. It's Unit 1. I'm going to give you a little bit of a tour so you kind of know what to expect. It has basically everything from Khan Academy, so don't bother watching the videos. This will just take you through everything they talk about. Yeah, I didn't even study my own Quizlet yet. But basically, it goes video by video, text by text. I just included the most important things. And then once I got through a section, this is a little bit of a longer one, but the rest of them are a lot shorter. I went through the quizzes and I took out some of the best questions that I thought would help you review this knowledge so you wouldn't have to keep redoing this. You could just take the questions and check your understanding. So there's a lot of questions like that. It goes by really fast. You do the readings, all that jazz. And then you go back and there's some more and then the questions again. So it should really help you test your knowledge. I'm currently working on another one. It'll be for Unit 2. Unit 2 is a lot larger, so it's taking me a little bit, but I believe by probably 1 in the morning it will be complete, and then I'm going to start working on civil rights and civil liberties, and that would conclude that, and I'll have a video like this to go through everything. So hopefully that all makes sense to you, and if you have any questions, let me know. And yeah, have a great day, guys.